Thank you, Stephanie. I'm going to take my laptop up here because my vision isn't so good in that direction or that direction. So I'm going to click the slides as I go along. That was a great introduction, thank you. Just by way of background and training, I am a nurse practitioner and I practice in cardiology. I actually continue to practice in cardiology. FDA and CDRH allows us that opportunity to do that. So it's wonderful to continue to be in the trenches with everyone else in clinical practice. Thank you for the invitation to address this topic today. It's wonderful to see interest in data quality and the potential to leverage a case for quality principles in this space. And Rachel, thank you for the great, really segue into taking a deeper dive into what CDRH has done in this space. And I can probably sum it up to say I agree with everything that Rachel said, representing the center. We're very grateful to have the NEST program, to have Rachel in the position that she is, and in the process of learning all of the tools and resources that will be necessary to build this great resource. What I'd like to talk about today is kind of communicate CDRH's message regarding our strategic priority to establish a national evaluation system for health technologies, NEST, and how CDRH fits into NEST as a stakeholder. Report on some of the very important work that we're doing in this space, and specifically how CDRH can use RWE, and I'll abbreviate to RWE, so and real-world data will be RWD, RWE for regulatory decisions. So several years ago, under Dr. Sharon's leadership, CDRH established our vision statement, and that is that patients in the U.S. have access to high-quality, safe, and effective medical devices of public health importance first in the world. As we started to think about how we could accomplish this first in the world without sacrificing an evidence base that it really relies upon safety and effectiveness, we started to think about collaborative efforts and the need to tap into existing information, infrastructures, perhaps building new infrastructures to expedite these products to market more quickly to benefit patients that need them. So if we're going to continue to maintain our standards and make sure that we have the evidence base necessary to establish safety and effectiveness, and we want the U.S. market to be something where new technologies get to patients quickly, we need to rethink about how we do business. So the solution is targeting efforts to reduce the time and cost of the total product life cycle. This includes areas such as device development, assessment, review, manufacturing, monitoring, the list really goes on. Again, without compromising the reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness standard, which protects patients in receiving these devices. So we looked at our conventional way of thinking. I think Rachel talked about this in a different sort of illustration, so I'll give you another illustration of the same concept. As we worked, as we looked at our conventional way of thinking, we had this very binary sort of decision of pre-market review. Approval or clearance to market, and then going into the post-market surveillance world. And our post-market surveillance world primarily consisted of MDR reporting. We've taken some steps to try to shift the decision-making point to the left earlier so that patients can get access to these important medical technologies. We've done that through more formalizing our benefit-risk approach. You may be aware of the benefit-risk guidance that we published a few years ago, and we talked a lot about that benefit-risk decision-making for approving products in the PMA or the 510K clearance track. And we had to make sure that our decisions are based on understanding what patients feel about the risks. This is really folded into our benefit-risk decision-making. How do patients feel about the risks and their perceptions about really the benefit and alternative therapies that might be available to patients, and how critical these therapies are to their care or their disease state. We've established new programs in that vein, such as the Expedited Access Program, or what 21st Century Cures is referring to as the Breakthrough Device Pathway, for therapies and devices for which there really aren't good alternatives for treating patients that have very serious and life-threatening conditions. So the problem is that this is a further shift to the left, but in looking at the time to market, it's still not enough, and we felt we needed to do more. So as we think about how we make a more substantial shift to the left and help to get these technologies to patients. Oops, sorry. Oh. Is it the right one or the left one? My apologies, going in the wrong direction. There we go. Okay. So to get these products to patients more quickly, there are a few parts to the equation, but one is most critical, and that's having confidence in the data that's collected in the post-market and making sure that it's high quality enough and that if there were safety issues or concerns that arise, it can be identified and acted upon in a timely fashion. So we looked at what could be incorporated in the post-market space that might help give us better confidence. Active surveillance, which better protects patients. We have registries that are collecting data. When we talk about active surveillance, this is really sort of the registry model. And leverage real-world evidence to support that regulatory decision. And that regulatory decision might be approving earlier when we know we have really good high-quality data that can be collected in the post-market. A shared system to inform the entire ecosystem, the patients, the clinicians, the providers, the payers, FDA, industry. And this process has to be embedded in the healthcare system where the data is collected during routine care. It has to be part of the flow. When you add additional burdens on the treatment and in that treatment space, you create more burdens on the providers, more burdens on those folks who are entering the data into these systems. So the better we can make that process more efficient. For example, in some registries, we see that data is populated into case report forms that registries are collecting data from the actual point of care. In the cath lab, you might have the cath lab system that is able to populate into a case report form procedural data, baseline demographics. These are the kinds of things I'm talking about that can help improve data flow and burden better quality because you're having a direct linkage, into the data collection system. So we believe that leveraging existing infrastructures such as registries help build that into infrastructure such as NEST, and we can get to a decision more quickly, realizing that we don't know everything about the product at the time of approval, but we have pretty good confidence in continuing to collect data in the post-market. So critical to this evolution is understanding the opportunities for evidence generation along the total product life cycle. The opportunities that I kind of outlined here involve some pretty major principles along the TPLC, or the total product life cycle. Flexibility is important. We have to be agile and responsive to the needs. We can't always get what we want. Perhaps that's a decision that we would like to make on the pre-market side, for example. But if we're flexible, we can get what we need. And I say flexibility also has to do with our regulations. You know, we are a regulatory agency, not that I need to remind those in the room. But, you know, regulations might be our operating principle, might be our regulatory requirement, but our operating principles are more about doing what's practical, what makes sense, and looking at our regulations through that lens, and the ability to be flexible enough to interpret the regulation in a way that allows us to get to where we want to be. So under our center director's leadership, I think that's pretty much been the mantra at our center. Innovation is really important. Real-world evidence, that significant human experience with marketed device, and clinical research incorporated, again, into that clinical practice and workflow. That's innovative. Collaborations are very important. You heard a lot about NEST, industry groups, patient and clinician groups. With regard to industry groups, we have worked very closely with industry in certain models. There was a question earlier about these very large commercial databases where your products and an individual company knows the product performance. But it's quite siloed, and it may not connect to outcomes of interest, such as what are the clinical outcomes of patients who are receiving your device. You really need linkages. Linkages are really important. Patient and clinician groups, one of our other strategic priorities at the center is patient outreach and patient engagement. And we have worked very nicely in the real-world evidence space in that area as well. So this slide, I think, kind of pulls it all together when we're doing comparisons between clinical trial data, some of the more formal post-approval studies, and then what in the world do we have with these real-world data sources. You know, from a clinician's standpoint, and I think this might speak to the earlier comment from our American Medical Association representative here today, you know, from a clinician standpoint, clinical trials are great to help inform how a particular therapy has a role in clinical practice, but oftentimes it doesn't help predict how the patient sitting in your office in front of you, how they're going to respond. How will I respond based on data from a clinical trial that was quite sterile, you know, in patient inclusion, in how, you know, patients were followed, in long-term data. There's also a great opportunity to see how these products perform in real patients in clinical environments. However, the real-world data sources, the RWE sources, or the data collected during that routine patient care workflow can be messy. It can be unstructured. It lacks standard definitions. It's difficult to extract. It's not always scalable. We heard this as well. It's not easily interoperable with other systems. And that's critical, all these things, to linking to get additional data, linking systems. So the data sources, as you can see, I've given examples of EHRs, claims, registries. We've heard that. The administrative databases, such as those that might be commercial databases that companies have, very valuable to link to EHRs, valuable to link to long-term outcomes, such as we have done with some of our cases. I'll give you a couple of examples coming in a moment, where we do need longitudinal data for device performance, to evaluate device performance. And we have a model having linked to CMS for longitudinal data on how some of our really high-risk devices perform over time. So I won't go too far into saying how wonderful RWD and RWE are without talking about the good decisions requiring high-quality data. This is so important. So the good decision really feeds into that benefit-risk decision and that benefit-risk determination. It is very important that whatever is going in and the decision we make on coming out is based on data that we have confidence in. So the more confidence we have in that data quality, the more informed and less uncertainty we have around that benefit-risk decision. So we have used the term, and many of you have heard it possibly in other presentations, fit for purpose. Is the data fit for purpose? Is it fit for a regulatory purpose in our review specifically? Factors that can improve data quality, such as the systems and processes in place. You've heard that a lot, I'm sure, with manufacturing quality. It works the same for data quality. What are those processes in place that ensure data completeness, consistency, accuracy, and contain all the critical elements needed to evaluate a medical device and its claims? What processes are in place to ensure that quality and integrity of the data collected, such as a description of an integrated system? We will often ask sponsors to provide that for us. What are the integrated systems that you have created for collecting and cleaning and storing and monitoring and auditing this data and reviewing and reporting on the data, and really importantly, acting on the data? It's not all about the collecting, and it's not all about, you know, what we can do with it creatively, but really being able to act on things such as signals. So this is another diagram, a very similar diagram to what Rachel presented in terms of NEST and all of the stakeholders. We see the opportunity to become a collaborator in the evaluation of the products we regulate and to support the efforts for broader evidence generation. So what have we done in that space? Well, we awarded the grant to support NEST, the initial grant for the development of NEST, and that was the seed money in 2016. The MEDUFA user fee agreement, by the way, is still before Congress to be approved. So I can't tell you that today we have actually a legislative mandate, but we're getting there, I hope. Pilot projects will be funded, as Rachel talked about, to determine the usability of RWE, to expand indications for use, new clearances approvals, and improved device malfunction reporting. So all of those resources, we hope, will be created and stood up to fulfill those needs. Issue draft guidance to clarify how RWE may be used to support a regulatory decision. We issued that about a year ago. We received hundreds of public comments, really good comments. I can't really tell you where we are in the process of turning those comments into a final guidance, but stay tuned. I can also say that we learned a lot from hearing from the community, and I think particularly with regard to relevance and reliability components of quality data, you're going to see some more details in that space. Increase access to and use of RWE to support regulatory decisions, that is our strategic priority. We actually have benchmarks for that at certain time points through this year, and I'll show you in a moment a few examples of how we're getting to that, reaching those benchmarks. And work with the medical device ecosystem. We have federal partners. We meet with CMS. We bring CMS to industry at the table. We talk very early on about the evidence that is required for determining reasonable safety and effectiveness. And we talk, CMS and other payers have the opportunity to talk about what's reasonable and necessary, because we do have different missions, but that doesn't mean that we can't still use the same data to meet those purposes. So again, Rachel talked a little bit about the value proposition. I'm going into this maybe a little more specifically to say this is how we view the value proposition for patients and clinicians. The ability to get more timely access to safer, more effective devices, and better information about the use of a given device. And we want patients to be part of that voice. We want their voice. We want to hear about what is important to you. We did hear that they want these devices sooner, And we are responding by moving that bar a little to the left because we have more confidence on the right, which is our post-market space. Hospitals and healthcare systems want to improve quality and reliable assurance of safety. Many of you in the room really are NEST stakeholders. So I really hope that you respond not only to, the calls for pilot projects, but also think about how you might fit into this infrastructure. Payers, obviously high quality evidence on device performance and clinical practice helps in the reimbursement side of things, and we have been working for quite a while with healthcare providers. We have moved beyond CMS to now looking at the very large payers, Mercy Healthcare Systems, Kaiser Permanente. We've had really interesting meetings with these folks. Medical device industry, high quality evidence again, the potential for pre- and post-market shift, and may obviate really the need for FDA pre-market review of some device modifications because of more timely and informative routine data collection. And what I mean by that and what we've seen in real time is that along the total product life cycle, because we have a more robust post-market evaluation, that data is often relied upon by industry to improve device iterations that may not always require a study, that may not always require that really expensive clinical trial. We can leverage the data in registries, for example, to help inform the device iteration process. So some regulatory uses for RWE, they include a control arm for a pivotal clinical study. We have examples of that. New indications for approved devices, so label expansion, studying new improvements to devices. Again, in that registry format I talked about, shifts in the balance, adverse event reporting, sort of in an automated fashion where you will actually be able to feed these events and events that occur into something like a registry or direct EHR into a system that will enable reporting more efficiently. So these are all virtual right now, thought processes, but we know it's possible. Replacing formal post-approval studies because there's linkages to real-world data sources. We have quite a bit of experience now with regulatory decisions in a lot of these areas, but we really do recommend reaching out to FDA to begin that early discussion of proposals to use RWE for a regulatory purpose. The pre-submission process to FDA is really the most efficient mechanism. Some of the non-regulatory uses for real-world evidence, informing the community on optimal care. Practice guidelines have often been developed as a result of really robust, high-quality registries who are able to report back to clinicians on perhaps care standards, guidelines. These types of things only help improve how patients are treated. Identifying needs and gaps. Sometimes we don't know what they are until we see the bigger picture on how the device is used in patients in a clinical environment. Market analysis, very large commercial databases that individual companies have that I said earlier are siloed, but there's the ability to link to other sources to get the clinical data that you need and outcome data. And assessing the quality of care is very important. So I'm going to finish up with a few examples. This is an example of a registry that collects the real-world use of peripheral interventional devices for patients with peripheral artery disease, or PAD. And it demonstrates how real-world data, RWD, gets data that is not typically gathered actually in a clinical trial. And the reason for that is that on the left, you really see in this PAD disease state, a lot of variability around patient treatment. Treatment heterogeneity is very varied, and you have different patient conditions, lots of comorbidities, disease severity. lots of different treatment options, and different training and specialty training on how to use some of these devices. On the right, you see quite a bit of variability, again, device heterogeneity, and variability around how the devices are treated, used to treat the condition. You have angioplasty balloons, you have stents. There are other devices in addition to those two. You have total occlusions, not really sure how to treat those. It's a complex disease area, and designing a randomized clinical trial is quite difficult and can be quite lengthy and repetitive. A lot of what Rachel said earlier, these one-off studies, repeating these one-off studies. So what we see is the ability to, instead of looking at each of those smaller circles as a clinical trial alone, when a registry is designed to collect that data, you have better characterization of the patient, better characterization of the disease and the treatments, and it gives us an idea and manufacturers an idea of better treatment that is individualized to the patient experience. Single-arm trials, what we've been able to do here is when a clinical trial for a new device is necessary, single-arm trials are possible because the registry presents an opportunity to be a comparator, a control, so to speak. Objective performance criteria have been established, and we have used those OPCs against a single-arm trial. So you don't have that large randomized clinical trial. You can use smaller numbers of patients in some cases. And we have actually embedded in registries, VQI, Vascular Quality Initiative is one of them, post-approval studies. So the next example has probably been fairly well advertised, I think. I think we've used this example pretty often when we're on the road talking about leveraging real-world evidence, because this has really been a superstar for us and industry, a win for all of the stakeholders. With the transcatheter heart valves, such as the TAVR devices, transaortic valvular replacement, the initial clinical trials were focused on the inoperable patients or very high-risk patients, but limited the therapy to only that patient population. So, and it didn't really include the more expansive or other populations, such as the intermediate risk patient, which is really the larger population group that could target that this therapy could be targeted for. And if you know, the standard therapy to this is the surgical replacement. So here we have a minimally invasive way of doing a very important life-saving procedure. So in thinking about expanding the treatment population, the sponsor was able to leverage the RWD in the high-quality TVT registry, which, by the way, is a registry that is a collaborative between STS, the Society for Thoracic Surgeons, and the American College of Cardiology, and it's called the TVT registry. And this included all uses of the TAVR device. So all uses would be on-label, off-label uses of the device, collecting data on how the device is used in the real world. Combined with other evidence, it allowed the determination of safety and effectiveness in a label expansion of the device into that larger patient population. The label expansion then went from the highest risk, the inoperable, and the high risk where we had randomized clinical trial data, to the lowest risk, reflecting the RWE derived from clinical practice and building upon the trial experience, the clinical trial experience. There was a major reduction in time to market. So going back to, the little graphic that I showed you on moving ourselves to the left and trying to get these valuable devices to patients as early as possible, this was a demonstration of the ability to do that. There was a major reduction in time to expand the label, a reduction in the sponsor's cost, because time is money, so not having to do that large clinical trial reduced costs. And I'm happy to say that with this project, we were very successful with not FDA specifically, but as a part of the team between FDA agreeing to endpoints and agreeing to what is practical and safe in this patient population, that it was first in the world to approve the Sapien 3 device, and I think that's been publicized perhaps fairly well by the company for that intermediate risk, and should be advertised because really it was a really nice success story. And more recently, very recently, mitral valves using the TVT registry, first in the world approval. And the approval for another device in addition to the Sapien, another device on the market that also was a first in the world approval. So with that said, it's probably true. I really love this quote because, and I'd like to end on it because I think this thought is important. I actually borrowed it from Owen Ferris, who is our clinical trials director in CDRH. It's probably true that one of the commonest features of new ideas, certainly of practical new ideas, is their imperfection. I think of that in the three areas that I talked about earlier: flexibility, the innovation, and the collaboration. So with that, I'll end, and I'm not sure if we're doing questions now or...
On. We have a few minutes for questions, if anyone has any questions.
So first of all, Karen, thank you. And just for perspective here, you know, Karen was gracious enough, and her management gracious enough to come in and talk today after I scrambled at the last minute to try to see if we could get somebody to bring in and come in and talk that perspective, right? A lot of what we're trying to do in Case for Quality is to keep building that value proposition, right? There is a way for us to get that win-win-win. The FDA, the patients, and industry, and some of these examples of what a future state might look like are great, and they help us tailor a lot of the work that we're doing to make sure that we're enabling that as much as possible. But to that end, I want to find out, so when you talk about and maybe this is also to feed into the NEST efforts and what's going on there, the example that you gave on the TAVR, right? From an FDA standpoint, what was it that made that successful, right? What was it that made that something that you could actually leverage and use?
I think it was collaboration, absolutely, between our ODE review team. I'll tout the great expertise of our cardiothoracic surgeon, Dr. John Lassinger. Really, our medical officers are fantastic in our center across all divisions, but specifically in this device space, and I do want to say the product area worked here. It may not work for all product areas, but if it does, this is a model. And the model was collaborating from the front end in what the trial design should look like, meeting with industry, talking to them about, you know, how is it that you want to study and test this device? What is your pathway to approval? What data and evidence do you think is going to be necessary? And then, of course, there's a lot of negotiation about what FDA would want to see to determine reasonable safety and effectiveness. At the same time, we brought CMS to the table. So, you know, this patient population is typically older and very sick. We knew it was important that we bring in the large payer that would be reimbursing for this device. So bringing everyone together, we were able to come to an agreement on what the endpoints would look like, ask questions about the post-market even before we got to the pre-market approval. What would we like to see collected in the post-market, and is there an infrastructure available to collect that data? And fortunately, in this space, there was. You know, the TVT registry was developed sort of in the same time. A lot of the stars need to align sometimes near the same time. But all of this was happening, professional society interested in wanting to be that registry that collects the data. So with having alignment in the areas that are important, what needs to be done to get the product approved, what needs to be done to have continuous surveillance of the product in the post-market, and the ability to embed that post-approval study potentially in this registry. CMS agreeing that this looks like a good plan, not committing that we'll cover it, but it looks like a good plan, and everything is executed. And at the end of the day, what was really wonderful to see is that when we got to approval, because CMS will not commit on reimbursement until, we move to that, we've approved the device, but they were part of the process along the way, and they agreed that coverage with evidence decision is appropriate here, and we will cover, made that decision rapidly in terms of reimbursement decisions, and really it was quite rapid, and as long as a site participated in the TVT registry they agreed to be of a high-quality registry, then this device is reimbursed for all patients treated who met, the criteria, which is basically the labeled indication for TAVR device. So that's, I guess, probably pretty much the summary.
Karen, thanks for a great overview. And the TVT registry, I think, has been an excellent example of, on many fronts, of the positive opportunity of with really excellent data. Some of the learnings that I think have come out along the way as we think about it in terms of NEST and what we're going to need to address. Number one, the TVT registry works for these highly complex, expensive devices, but as we think about a more extensible system for products that don't have the price point and the opportunity for that TVT registry structure, that's one of the needs and opportunities that we're going to have to deal with NEST. So I think for this product class, if you will, it's a really good example from that context. The other thing that Rachel touched on in terms of one of her key criteria is near real-time evidence, and I think in the context of TVT, if I were to share what I hear from the manufacturers, is that feedback loop has not been as timely as certainly they would like, and I think all of us would like, in terms of the, if you will, the safety surveillance signal part of it that we're going to need to get to. So it's an excellent step along the journey, and as we think about NEST, that's going to be, I think, two of the areas that we're going to have to address so that we have more broad application.
I agree. If I could just make one comment about that, Bill, thank you for that, because I agree. I have actually been in the trenches with all this activity as part of my everyday work. So I think your points are well taken. There are other pain points that, we know them now, and certainly looking at strategies to reduce. But I think you bring up a good point about the real need for the registries to work in this ecosystem to understand the other stakeholders' needs. Stakeholders' needs to industry might be, we have data that could be very valuable for your label expansion. That's one kind of business arrangement. But the other is listening to industry when they say, we need data in more real time. How can we shorten that period of time to clean this data, particularly data that is available through CMS if we want to link to long-term and that longitudinal outcome. That data isn't available typically for 6 months to a year. However, in the TAVR space, this is one really unique pilot that we have done with CMS. Daniel Kanyas has worked at FDA, and he also, well, full-time now at CMS, but he's detailed back to us a day in a period of time, a couple days a month, and these folks are able to go actually to where the data sits in the warehouses at CMS, and to have more real-time accessibility to this data. But that interoperability between systems only exists for this TVT. But at least it is a pilot to see what is possible for other registries. So hopefully, again, this will grow.
Hi, I'm Nathan Tenzer from Edwards Life Sciences, the industry partner on this side of the of this partnership. So I'd like to offer our perspective. You know, when on your slide you had the three bubbles there of increasing size. And the inoperable space, the U.S. was in the mid-40s for the approval. So we were a late player, and to move in just a few short years to being the first in the world to move into this space is a remarkable transition. And it's no small feat. It requires a lot of work, a lot of courage from the FDA and from other partners in this. And it's a complete transformation for the access to care that Americans have. And so I just want to applaud your efforts and thank you for the partnership.
Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate that.
Thanks for the review. And one of the things, Bill, you mentioned about the gap. For smaller, less expensive products, there won't be registries. But a way to fill that gap might be to use things like simulations and Bayesian models and things like that. What are your thoughts on that for the rest of us who aren't participating in this high-cost market? How does the agency look at that type of work?
Absolutely. That's part of innovation, you know, the different methodologies. This is a very new area to really understand what are the statistical analysis approaches to this really rough data. You know, how do we control, for example, all this missing data? You know, that's a real concern. And in some cases, that's where the improvements lie. Not only, you know, on the front end to get better data in so we're not missing, but how do we control for that when it is difficult in a real-world environment to say, well, what is it, because, you know, this data is missing because there's a lot of work clinicians are doing in a day, and research coordinators to get the quality of life tool completed, to make sure that this data is available. What can be done to help control for these things? So that is a big part of it. Hopefully, NEST will provide a resource for some of the methodological methods that can be used to analyze data like this. And I think really importantly, it might be not only linking to those resources, and FDA has within our walls some expertise actually in designing this within our Division of Epidemiology. So that experience is very valuable, has already been helpful in planning those post-approval studies, but really understands it in the big data space. So between, I think, the resources FDA has available, our willingness to look at different methods, but most importantly in this space, I can't underscore this enough. It is very important that if you want to use this data, that you have a pre-specified plan for the question and how you're going to analyze it. Because the very first question we're going to have for you when you come in to speak with us in a pre-submission setting is, what's the question and what is your plan, among other things. Of course, what's the data source or sources, but absolutely pre-specified is extremely important for all the obvious reasons.
Yeah, so hi, Karen. Excuse me, I just want to reiterate how exciting this is, what you're putting out there. It's fantastic. I do want to build on what Luann just said, because she actually stole my question. But if you go to slide 4, I think, slide 4 or 5, and you're talking about shifting left. I'm not going to ask the question. Maybe I'll just.
This one?
I think yes, that's
the final
good.
Shift to the left. Okay.
Yeah. So I think computer-based modeling and simulation is absolutely something that needs to be added to the slide. Think of it as you've got the virtual clinical trials and then you have the digital clinical trials, and they complement each other. And I know MDIC is doing a lot of work, a lot of great leadership on this topic. So I think there's a natural synergy between NEST and some of the other work that MDIC is doing.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And I will tell you, we have that familiarity. Owen speaks to this frequently, and of course, he's my boss, and I do a lot of this work in the clinical trial space. It's a simulation. So we're very pleased with what MDIC has been able to offer as we've worked with, been a partner in development of that. So thank you, because I have to say, I'm not sure that I really, this is where, you know, innovation and having the light bulbs in the room help quite a bit, because that's something I hadn't thought about. So make sure, Bill, that's on your table and agenda, and Rachel too. And I'll take the message back to Owen, but thank you.
So just a comment about registries and the discussion about how costly it can be to set up a registry, and certainly labor intensive once it gets to the clinical space. Having worked at 4 hospitals that all required me to fill out every single data element for the ICD registry for coverage with evidence development. But we learned a lot. And so one of the things that we learned, and I think that, again, an argument for something like NEST, is we learned that we did not need to collect all of those data elements, that in time we discovered, for example, that of clinical variables that we went from about 22 to do risk adjustment. We got the same power of risk adjustment with 11 to 12. Basically, we cut the number of data elements that were required in half. The second thing that we found is that there was expansion of indications, again, cardiology, but with biventricular defibrillators, we found that there was really disproportionate benefit to patients with the very wide QRS with the left bundle branch block pattern. So that group became identified as, you know, we're often thinking who's not going to respond, but we figured out also who was going to respond. And then the third, is there enough registries out there now that I think the concept should maybe start to be, can we, a manufacturer, a professional society, can we bolt ourselves on to an existing registry? Because I think that was the secret sauce with TAVR. There were, you know, established registries. So I know everybody loves to own their own registry. Everybody loves to have complete control over every single data element. You know, yep, me too. I'd love to have a perfectly, you know, customized house, car, whatever, but it'll cost me a fortune. It will take forever, and I might not ever be able to drive the car or move into the house. So bolt-ons to existing registries, I think, is a potential strategy.
Yeah, thank you for that. Couldn't agree more. And I will tell you that that's happening. We already have talked about modules that will be add-on to registries, and primarily to do clinical investigation, because when you think about it, there is the potential to leverage that infrastructure that's already set up with sites, with case report forms. And if there's an add-on module, you might be able to do that clinical trial. You will. We have evidence of that you can embed that IDE, for example, in a registry. But to your point about the data points and the number of data points, 300 plus in TAVR. You know, that's a lot of variables to collect, and that's a lot of work. And there are full-time FTEs in hospitals to do this, let alone hospital having to pay, you know, $15,000 or $20,000 to participate, because it's a QA/QI structure where they will get reporting back for their payers or whatever benchmarks they need to meet. But with that said, you know, there's something to be said for data collection that is nice to know and then need to know. And I think the RAPID project, Terry's been part of this from the very beginning. The RAPID project, their aim on day one, when the clinicians got together to come to a consensus with industry on looking at all their case report forms for clinical trials, 100 elements. 100 elements, 100 core elements. And this would serve for a post-approval with build-on if you want to do a clinical trial or add-on modules. So yeah, that concept is, you're ahead of your time to suggest it, and fortunately we've had others, you know, who have a few that have been the same visionary.
Okay. Thank you.
Karen, thanks so much. Very exciting. One of the things that I've heard a couple of times is this concept of not only the breadth of information, but the timeliness and the speed of it, the concept of real time. And I could envision a situation where information coming in can be very informative and might actually impact the label. You talked about label expansion, but even instructions for use or how devices are used. Is the regulatory apparatus flexible enough to allow changes to labels where the information could be very helpful, but the process of a label change is not as real time, unfortunately. So any thoughts on the regulatory encumbrances to allow us to really take advantage of this information?
Yeah, I think one word I would use is non-encumbered. I mean, that's just it, the flexibility of being able to come to us early and tell us what it is that you're attempting to do. And are you leveraging real-world evidence? And we'll tell you what's necessary. If it's a label expansion to an indication, to a different patient population, that has its set of requirements. If it's a device iteration or device, some sort of design change or something else in the labeling, how to use the device in a different way or, some other sort of instructions for use. We have different pathways for that, but I will tell you, we have been really successful in updating labeling from post-approval studies that were nested in registries. That just automatically this data came out of doing that study, and there was a clear indication that labeling needed to be updated. And it could be, for a safety concern. There could be something that comes out of analyzing that data that says, we didn't see this in the purest of the clinical trial, but now it's broadened into the general population. And, these are kinds of things that we're seeing in the registry data as it's analyzed on a periodic basis for an active surveillance model. And it can update the label, and then it goes in the positive direction or in a direction that, needs to go to course correct because there might be some, risks to patients. Does that answer your question? Okay.
So when I saw this slide, I had the same thought that Luann and Jason did. And to build on what was said, I think one of the key values of virtual is actually feeding real-world evidence into a virtual model so that it actually becomes a virtuous circle where the virtual feeds the real and the real feeds the virtual so that you get to that point where you can have that, the analyst term is that digital twin.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think central to that is going to be the validation, right, along the way. But I think you had some pretty good experience with that, Bill, right, with, the simulations you have already done, the simulated patient. Great, that's exciting. I really hadn't explored that pushed it to the point, but this feedback is very helpful to see the possibilities. Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate the time.